friends, welcome back, or welcome if you're new here. My name is Stacy and I am the Chapter Conundrum, and in today's video we are going to do my December wrap up. So we're going to talk about all the books I read in the month of December and how I felt about them. And last month I managed to read 9 books totaling 2,823 pages. So in a normal month, I would say I would read more than this. However, December was super busy in terms of other stuff. I spent a lot of time either with some kind of social obligation, like hanging out with friends and family, or just getting ready for Christmas, doing a ton of baking, getting the decorations out, all that kind of stuff. And so I feel like I did fairly well, especially considering 2025 was just a slower reading year for me in general. And I kicked the month off reading some holiday romances, and I actually vlogged my experience. So if you're curious, you can go watch the vlog. But the first of those that we have to talk about today is Holiday Romance by Catherine Walsh, and this is the first book in the Fitzpatrick Christmas series. And I really liked this one. I gave it a 4.5-star rating. Essentially, in here you follow Molly and Andrew, and they are 2 Irish expats living in the US, and they are headed home for Christmas. And the 2 of them have traveled together on the same flight home to Christmas for eons. But this year, they're having some issues due to a storm, so their flight is delayed or canceled. I can't remember which. And it's essentially their journey of trying to get home for the holidays, but they fall for each other in the process. So one of the tropes that this one involves, I can't really tell you about because it's spoilery, but suffice it to say that I really enjoyed this trope. And the other one that this falls into is Grumpy Sunshine. Our love interest here is huge on Christmas, and our main character is like less excited about Christmas. So that makes for a fun dynamic in this type of read. So one thing I really liked about this is that it was really clear why these 2 characters developed a romance together. The author really was intentional and thought about why these 2 would make a good couple, and she definitely made that layered and nuanced throughout the book. I find with a lot of romance, it can be a little bit frustrating if the author throws 2 characters together just because they think each other are physically attractive. But this one is so much more intentional than that, so I definitely appreciated it for that reason. I also just thought it was cute, and I appreciated that it was less cheesy than a lot of typical Christmas romances would be. I did feel like this definitely took some time to talk about some serious topics and had stuff outside the romance just with the characters themselves or their families as well. I appreciated how slow burn this one was, and that we got to see snippets from the past years of these 2 on their flights and kind of how that went and sort of how they felt about it. My only real complaint here was that I wanted the third act conflict to have a bit more nuance and to just kind of see these characters together more afterwards and to sort of explore their dynamic together as a couple. And then next up, I ended up looking into the sequels because I enjoyed this one and figuring out that there was a short story following these same characters hosting their families for the first time for Christmas in Chicago, where they live. And you could get that for free if you signed up for the author's newsletter. So I went ahead and did that, and then I also read that. And that one is called A Mistletoe Kiss, and I gave that a 4-star rating. So I was really glad that I picked this up and read it right after finishing a holiday romance, especially because a good chunk of it involves a spicy scene between our 2 main characters here. And I'm somebody who I want to be invested in the emotions of the characters before getting into the spicy scenes in order to enjoy them more. And so if that is also you, I would recommend, if you want to read the short story, pick it up and read it shortly after finishing holiday romance as well. It was interesting to get to explore the character dynamics of these 2 as a couple a little bit more, but I still wanted more of it in terms of like the emotional aspect of their relationship a little bit more. I feel like the novel and the short story kind of delved more into the practical side of how they were as a couple, which was still interesting, but I just wanted it to delve a little bit deeper. I also forgot to mention, but this does have a couple of spicy moments as well. But the short story is like really, I think, the spiciest scene of the 2. I then picked up and read Lovelight Farms by B.K. Borison, and this is the first book in the Lovelight series. And in here you follow the owner of a struggling Christmas tree farm who has submitted herself and the farm for a contest with a social media influencer who's like a travel vlogger kind of thing. And she's hoping that she ends up winning this contest so that the vlogger comes and has a great experience at the farm and then drums up more business for them. But the only problem is this influencer tends to do interesting deep dives and bios into the business owners and kind of like the backstory of the businesses as well. And she has sort of romanticized things on her application to this contest and said that she runs the farm with her boyfriend. So when the influencer does end up choosing her farm in order to be part of this contest, she ends up having to convince her best friend Luca to fake date her in order to avoid like being obvious that she lied about it. So while I thought this was objectively a great book, it wasn't necessarily all to my reading taste. And by that I mean that the plot of this was kind of just like very slow to kick in. Like the influencer doesn't even show up until I think like the 70 or 80% mark of this book, to give you an idea. And what we really do focus on instead is creating an atmosphere in everything that these characters are doing. So there's a lot of description, but it's not necessarily lengthy chunks of description. It's more like a snippet here, a snippet there. And there's also a lot of focus on the characters and the moments that they share between them. So this was cute, and it also had some good spicy scenes in it. It also was a little bit more on the cheesy side, and also kind of like more what I would think about when I think about a Christmas romance, but not to the level of like Hallmark movie cheesy. It definitely was cute, had some good moments, and did a really good job of intriguing you about the couples that are going to be followed in the sequels. It was just more of like a cozy, character focused and descriptive vibe than what I typically enjoy. After that, I ended up picking up and reading a anticipated release that ended up being a disappointment and a dud for me. Again, this is a case of it wasn't objectively a bad book, but it was just kind of like the antithesis of what I tend to enjoy with how it's written and how it was put together. And I'm talking about The Things Gods Break, which is the second Crucible book by Abigail Owens. And I ended up giving this one a 2-star rating. So I had previously read and enjoyed book 1 in the series, The Games Gods Play, back in October. And I'm pretty sure I gave it like a 3.5, 3.75. And in there you follow our main character who's chosen by Hades to represent him in the trials to determine who the next ruling Greek god will be, and book 1 really follows all of that. I'm not going to tell you where it leaves off or the plot of book 2 because I definitely feel like that's a spoiler, but you're continuing the story from the ending of book 1, and you pick up kind of like right where book 1 ends, but then some things get introduced into the story that made it feel more like a mindfuck situation in some ways. Like you're jumping around from scene to scene, not necessarily in chronological order, and it just felt really convenient, and like the author was purposefully doing that to give us what she thought were going to be impactful moments with the characters. And I feel like if you were a character reader or you had more development between these characters in book 1, it would have made more sense, or like I would have enjoyed it a whole lot more. But in doing it, she didn't really introduce how this was happening properly. There wasn't really any context for what was happening up front. You did get some reveals kind of like later on in the book that did semi-explain what was happening or why it was happening. And those reveals were interesting for sure. So you could tell like the author did have a plan. She just constructed it in a way that really did not work for me as a reader. It felt like I had whiplash and that the story was like super constructed. Like it didn't feel like it had an organic flow, and it felt like it was intentional in terms of like making the reader experience certain things with the characters that I don't necessarily feel like I needed to experience. Like I was more in this series for the plot and the overarching story and some kind of like reveals about other characters. So it really didn't work for me in that respect. And then on top of that, we ended up having some like logical queries or logical flaws introduced that I was like, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense because of that, which is something I never really enjoy in any kind of book I read, but especially like thrillers and fantasy for some reason. Also, with the way this one was constructed, I felt like the stakes were like quite lower or almost non-existent, because when something bad happened, like it didn't really stick. And I can't really tell you why that is because I feel like that's spoilery, but just suffice it to say that I didn't appreciate that element to this either and found that frustrating. So yeah, in all the ways, it managed to kind of go complete opposite direction in terms of like what I enjoy in books. So sadly, this one really was a bummer for me. But I will say, if you're a different type of reader, I could see someone loving this and calling it a favorite. Because if you are a character reader who wanted more character moments and like exploring how certain events happened, then like you are absolutely going to love this book. Unfortunately, though, it left me feeling like I have no desire to pick up the final book in the series when it drops in 2026. So I have decided to DNF the series and just call it here. After that, I ended up picking up a book that I was gifted for Christmas. I Hate Fairyland, the 8th volume in the series, which is the most current one. It was rumored to be the final installment in the series. It's definitely not. I can say that with certainty. And I also actually looked into it, and volume 9 is supposed to be released in March. What it does do is end like the first story arc of the series. Arguably, there's kind of like a full circle moment in the ending of this, and really don't have an idea of the direction of what's going to happen next. I mean, you somewhat know, but there's a lot that could be done with it, so it'll be interesting to maybe see how the author and illustrators tackle the next volume. And in this series, you follow Gertrude, who has been sucked into Fairyland as a child, but the clincher is she's stuck in her 6-year-old body, and she's been stuck in Fairyland for however many years now. I think like 30 years. So she's very salty about being there, and she is wreaking all kinds of havoc in Fairyland. This series is definitely a lot of fun. It definitely has a lot of kind of like darker but funny moments, and it's definitely enjoyable for what it is. I think my problem at this point is that I just felt like we haven't really gotten anything like new or revolutionary for the last several volumes, and so I just feel like it's kind of like more of the same fare. So if you really loved the first couple installments and you just want more of the same, then you're gonna end up really liking the series. But I kind of wanted it to like grow and develop and just see where things go and have more of like a strong overarching plot. I mean, don't get me wrong, these definitely do have an overarching plot for the most part. There's some volumes that kind of like have willy-nilly stuff thrown in. This is not one of them. This definitely had like an overarching story that I thought was okay. I didn't hate it and I didn't love it. I was entertained by it for sure, and there were some good moments. But yeah, at this point, I just kind of feel like it's getting a little bit stale for me, and I'm not sure if I'm gonna call it with the series here or try out volume 9. I think maybe it depends for me if my library or Hoopla get the newest installment when it drops. They did not have volume 8, which is why I had this on my wish list. We physically own 1 through 4 and then 8. Because 8 is where I was up to in the series. I have been reading these on my tablet, but Jake has also read the first one and he likes it. So that's kind of why we've been acquiring the physical copies as well, because he wants to read them physically. But yeah, all that to say, I'm not sure if I'm going to call the series here or if I'm going to try one more installment, because it's going to be like the start of a new story arc to kind of see the direction and then make a decision. Probably I'll wait and see if the new one's available. But either way, I'm in no rush to pick it up. And I ended up giving this one a 3.25 star rating. It was fine. It wasn't revolutionary. And I'm kind of over the series having like one gimmick that it exploits over and over and over again at this point. But if you haven't yet started the series, I definitely recommend trying the first volume at least, because it's a really fun time. Next up, I picked up and read Mate by Ali Hazelwood, and this is her new release that is the second and final installment in the Bride duology, and it follows our main character from book 1's best friend. So we follow Serena in here, and this one has some interesting political developments between like the werewolves, the vampires, and the humans. I definitely thought Ali Hazelwood did an excellent job kind of balancing between the political plot line, the romance, and the character moments, and just kind of like the character dynamics between the friendship of her and Misery, as well as the romance between her and her mate. So the tropes involved in this one are like fated mates, but also forbidden romance, which I thought was kind of a unique and fun pairing that I hadn't seen done before. And of course, leave it to Ali Hazelwood to have her signature like strong female main character who's very autonomous, has opinions, and is going to do what she wants to do at times. So I think the mashup of kind of like those things worked really well for me. I ended up rating this a 4.25 star. I will say I also think this is the spiciest Ali Hazelwood book that I have read to date. It was more of a like slow setup in the beginning, but the second half of this was a lot of spicy scenes. So just be aware of that going in if that's something you're going to care about one way or the other. But overall, I had a good time. I enjoyed the character dynamics. I enjoyed the story. And yeah, 4.25 stars. And in a much different direction, after finishing that, I picked up What Does It Feel Like by Sophie Kinsella. And Sophie Kinsella is a contemporary romance author who tends to write really like comedic chick lit stuff. But this is much different than her usual fare because it's a very autobiographical type story, even though it's fiction, where she really inserts her own experience into the character. And in here, you follow the main character as she's being diagnosed with a glioblastoma, which is a cancerous brain tumor, and kind of like how she's coping and how she's experiencing everything that goes along with that diagnosis. And also, a couple weeks before I picked this up, the author Sophie Kinsella did pass away due to that condition as well. So that definitely made this hit very differently. It definitely made it more of an emotional reading experience. And I buddy read this one with Kelly over at Coffee Cups and Books, and we had an interesting discussion on some of the themes in this one. This is the kind of read where I feel like if you were to reread this like several times over, you would pull something different out of the experience every time, because there's so much like deep emotion and like thought-provoking stuff in here pertaining to like terminal diagnosis and even chronic illness. And while this deals with a lot of heavy topics, Sophie Kinsella is not a heavy writer. And so she brings some levity to this situation for sure with her tone and her writing. So that was just kind of a really interesting balance as well. And I think that's partly why it's as thought-provoking as it is, because she'll tell you something, but it's really left up to the reader to kind of like think about what she's telling you and think deeper and to kind of like expand on what she's telling you. This is also not necessarily like a streamlined story like her typical novels would be. This is told in vignettes, and so it's kind of like snippets of the character having like different experiences as they relate to the overall experience she's having. And for me, that's not my favorite storytelling style. I do understand why the decision was made for this particular book, because I do feel like it lends itself more to like the lighter tone, being that you can kind of like pick and choose what you're talking about and what tone you're talking about it in with more of like the vignette style. And definitely I feel like Sophie Kinsella was definitely very intentional when she chose what to write in here. She kind of explains it as like her exploring her own experience through a character's experience. But there's definitely a lot of snippets in here that relate to kind of like her overall experience that were very interesting. So she's got things about like how in a certain scene she's like downplaying to a doctor all of her symptoms and kind of like how she's experiencing, but then on a deeper level you kind of understand like, oh, this is just part of how she's coping with having all of this stuff happen to her. And you understand because you've seen everything leading up to this appointment that she is downplaying and like she is actually experiencing it in a much more adverse way than what she's describing. But it's also interesting to understand like her kind of downplaying this is how she's coping mentally. She doesn't want to be in a worse mood or a worse like state. She wants to enjoy the time she has left. And so it's like her balancing act of that. There's also things in here that are tied to her identity as a person. And so like at the beginning, she's just kind of like got the identity of like she's a writer and she's a little bit fatigued with having that identity on a social level. But then it sort of goes into like how her social identity more becomes about how she's doing. And then it sort of shows you how her diagnosis and her illness is kind of like taken over her social identity in a way. There's definitely some relatable stuff about her wanting and kind of feeling like she needs answers in terms of her diagnosis and just like medical stuff she's experiencing, which I think is one of the toughest things when you're facing something and you don't know what it is and you're kind of like struggling. Like you could really just use some answers. And so I think this showcases that very well as well. But even beyond all that, it's really about how she's kind of like focusing on positive things and what she deems important even going through all of that and how she wants to experience the time she has left and just kind of like how endearing some of that type of stuff is as well. So yeah, this one is definitely very emotional. It packs a punch. It touches on so many things that are very thought-provoking, and it's a very interesting read, especially if you are somebody or know somebody struggling with either chronic illness or terminal illness. And also, my goodness, does the ending of this feel more impactful knowing that the author has passed away. I don't know if I remembered to say, but I ended up rating this a 4.25 star. And essentially, even though I have so many amazing things to say about this one and can tell like how much effort went into it, I think just the fact that it's told in vignettes and only has like highlights of the character's experience is really what impacted my overall enjoyment. Next up, I picked up and read How to Become the Dark Lord and Die Trying by Django Wexler. And this is the first book in the Dark Lord Davi duology. In here, you're following Davi, who is stuck in some kind of time loop. And essentially, things keep resetting on her until she sort of moves towards becoming the Dark Lord. And this is really more of like a satirical, comedic, funny read. Davi's character is quite spunky and also irreverent, like her narrating things to you. She has some really funny like asides and commentary as she's telling you the story, and in here they're told in footnotes On the audio, there's kind of like a different sound effect for when she's speaking to you in a footnote. I enjoyed them. I know not everybody likes footnotes or character interjection like that. So if you don't love character interjection, but this sounds like a read you would enjoy, maybe read this physically, because the audiobook does just like insert them as the story plays out. Whereas in here, you could choose to either read the footnotes or not. Personally, I enjoyed them, and I also liked how the audio production handled them as well. I definitely enjoyed that there were a lot of pop culture references in here. Like, we definitely had Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, Star Wars, all those types of references in here. I like that this explored breaking some typical fantasy stereotypes and kind of made fun of them in certain ways. But what I struggled with and what I didn't love so much was really the storytelling style. Not in the narration or the footnotes, more in how the story was structured. You definitely felt like you were just kind of along for the ride on this adventure with the character. You weren't really given any context for things up front or any like bigger picture answers as to like, what does being the Dark Lord entail? What does she plan to do once she's the Dark Lord? You don't really kind of get any foreshadowing for snippets to have any guesses or theories at things along the way as you're reading. And I think between the lack of context and the lack of like tidbits to kind of grasp on where you're going, I definitely struggled with my investment in this at times. I did still enjoy it for the good, funny moments and for what it is, but it definitely was not a favorite due to the storytelling structure and style. The ending of this is interesting for sure, and it does have me a little bit curious, but I think I'm going to give the sequel on this a pass. I just have things I'm much more prone to like that I'm more interested in prioritizing and picking up, I think. And I don't know if I said, but I gave this a 3-star rating. I definitely think this has potential to be a favorite for other types of readers, but not necessarily for me. I think I just needed it to take itself a little bit more seriously and still have some of like the banter and funny moments, but also just have more of like a structured plot with foreshadowing and nuance and kind of like more logic and explanations and exploration of the world and the magic and like all that type of stuff for me to love this. I am happy to say though that the book I finished my year out with was a good read, and that was The Trial of Rooker Flynn, the second book in the Locke Institute trilogy by Air Witham. And in this series, you are back in the world of Keymark following Jack Swift and Rooker Flynn as they are put into the Locke Institute, which is kind of like a labor or prison camp. It's all about their characters experiencing this camp, all the challenges they're facing, how they're overcoming those, how they're being creative with the cards they're dealt. A lot about their friendship and just the relationship dynamics they have with other inmates. So it's essentially how they're surviving and trying to thrive. I definitely enjoy the fast-paced, adventurous storytelling style in here, and I feel like Air Witham does an amazing job of being able to balance that with serious character moments and interesting backstory and tidbits about the characters, because I feel like it's very, very hard to have like a fast-paced, like snappy kind of book that also really delves into the heart of the characters and is really at its core about exploring the character relationships and the character dynamics. But somehow Air Witham manages to do it with this series. And I also really love that he manages to balance some humorous stuff with some horrific and more serious, dark elements. I think that's a talent that a lot of authors don't possess, and that's definitely a fine line to be able to walk. And it was really interesting to see all that come together and kind of continue in this installment in the series as the stakes get even higher. So the end of book 1 left us with a literal hanging cliffhanger, and we pick up in this installment right after the events of that. So it was fun to jump right back in. And I also really appreciated some of the character backstory moments that were explored more in here. I definitely felt like I got a better sense of how some of the events and some of the things to come were going to be more impactful for the character for having explored their backstory. So beyond enjoying the character's backstory and kind of like their current experience of how they're experiencing everything in the moment, I also thought that Rooker had a really amazing character arc in this installment that I enjoyed. And I also specifically really enjoyed one of the side characters in here, Patch, and kind of like everything that she was dealing with and going through and how that impacted the story overall. So those were kind of the things that stood out to me in the reading experience of this one. But I also was invested in the plot, and this one also leaves me with a massive cliffhanger. So I definitely need to be picking up book 3 in January. So that was all the books I managed to read in the month of December. Definitely let me know down below in the comments what you read and what your favorite read of last month was. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out if you want to, and have a great day. Bye!